Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and listening to this recording of a discussion that I will be having with Dr. Richard Lobban. We'll get to his background in just a moment, but my name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. And we're bringing you this conversation because of the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Today is March 3rd, so we are into our second week of this invasion, and we wanted to continue to bring insightful programs and stories and discussions to you, and we're excited to have this conversation with Dr. Lobban. For those of you who may not know, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we rely heavily on our members, donors, supporters, and sponsors. We really appreciate everyone who helps to make these programs possible, particularly our mission partner, Southern New Hampshire University. They really help to make sure that we can continue to bring insightful, engaging, and expert-led discussions to you and provide you with the information you need in order to make decisions and be a more informed global citizen. Having said that, we are a nonpartisan organization, and therefore we do not take any stances on policy, programs, political parties, or anything of the like. Therefore, the views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the speaker and do not necessarily represent those of the council, its members, sponsors, donors, etc. We are the platform for discussion, and we hope that you take the information that you learn here today and build out your understanding of this global issue. As I mentioned, we're so excited to have Dr. Lobban with us today. He's got a long history of experience with Russia, too long for me to actually go through it all, but the key points are he's done a lot of conflict journalism. He's particularly in Africa. He's followed the Russian military and their tactics in the Middle East and in Africa. He is also a professor at the Naval War College, although he's here just today as himself and not representing the Department of Defense or the War College itself. But we are so excited to have him joining us today. We'll bring him on screen here. And thank you, Dr. Lobban, for joining us.
Afternoon.
So I wanted to really start today's conversation off about we hear a lot of different conversations, a lot of different theories and explanations for why this is happening. Can you tell us a little bit about your insights into why Russia has decided to invade a sovereign nation?
Well, I turned immediately to answer that question with some of the classics in military science, and so the first case would be the so-called Thucydides trap, where he was a famous commentator about the Peloponnesian War. And in that particular case, he always discovered that the dominant power has to defend their dominance, and the subordinate or insurgent power has to, attack. In this case, it's not quite the same because the dominant power is doing the attacking and the subordinate power is doing the defense. So the fact that there's a disjuncture of risks really classic caused me to look at some of the other classics in military science, military history, to see why things are going really so poorly for Mr. Putin. So I turned to Sun Tzu, also a classic of everyone should read Sun Tzu, good entertainment. And one of the things that Sun Tzu said is that the best war is no war at all. So clearly that's failed for Putin because now he's grinding into an anti-civilian war when his plan for a 2 or 3 day war and the capitulation of the Zelensky government has failed. Sun Tzu also mentioned that you should know the terrain. That's the physical terrain and also the metaphorical terrain. Putin has failed in that respect. And you should also know your enemy. And here is where one of the classic mistakes of Putin has taken place and why it's already, dragging out. And then just to bring in an American, sort of, let's say, classical theoretician, the late Colin Powell, who had the so-called Powell Doctrine relative to Vietnam. And he said, basically, you should know what you're doing in the outset, have an absolute clear operational game plan, and have an exit strategy. Well, once again, if you follow that checklist, he's not followed the Powell Doctrine, which is, tried and true in that respect. And then maybe lastly, we have the case of Clausewitz, the classic theoretician and commentator about war in the 18th and 19th century, especially. And he said war is always about politics. And in this case, Putin has stumbled once again, and he's forgotten the politics that in this case, he's got low morale troops, even though there's a lot of force. And the Ukrainian resistance has high morale, and their force isn't so bad when it's deployed. We'll talk a little bit more later about the 40-mile column and how this supposed military asset of the Russians is now starting to turn into a liability, and that's what needs to be watched very closely in the next few days, how that will unfold. So those are a few reasons why I think that Putin is in a very serious problem. Of course, back in Russia too, now domestically with the resistance there, and we'll talk more about that. So how Putin will fare after this remains to be seen.
Yeah, and certainly there's evidence of overwhelming forces arrayed on the Russian side. I think estimates were up to 190,000 troops spread between Belarus and Russia along the Ukrainian border. And to your point, it seems like Putin and the world in general was thinking this would be over in 2 days. It took Putin a while to get all of his forces in to Russia, which may indicate that he did not think he needed all of those and was using them more as a negotiating tactic just to have them there. And now he's really bogged down in a sort of insurgency war a little bit. But he has only, at this point, last I read, only taken control of one major city. What is it that the Ukrainians have done that has really surprised Russia and the analysts who were thinking that this would be over so quickly?
Well, first of all, the resistance was unexpected, and he's an isolated, cloistered, self-delusional individual, given his fear of COVID, his fear of opposition, domestic opposition, and consequently, he gets bad information. It really is a classic case of the emperor wears no clothes. His world of lies and misrepresentation, they're stumbling on his own lies. First saying no troops were dying. Now they have to say, because of the Mother's Council, for example, and even Google statements for restaurant commentaries, the truth has seeped in. And so he's looking even more silly about his misrepresentations. I mean, especially that he's denazifying a Jewish president and bombing Babi Yar. So these are just crazy situations. And when your credibility as a leader collapses, then of course you've got some serious problems. And then even in the major force of this so-called 40-mile convoy, we're now finding out that there's defections, there's desertions, there's surrender, and there are also attacks. And this will get us into some of the specific weapon systems and tactics of the Ukrainian insurgents or counter-invasion forces, maybe in a next commentary.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get to that. But also we've been hearing, not only has the Ukrainian resistance been stronger than expected, there's also been a lot of logistical issues for the Russian army. And I've got two questions here. One, what's going on with these logistic issues? We've heard things such as potentially self-sabotage, Russian units poking holes in their gas tanks. We've heard of just vehicles breaking down, not enough fuel, not enough food. So what's behind all of that? Were they just really set on this 2 or 3 day expedition? And then also, what does this say for what message does this send to the entire world about the strength and readiness and preparedness of the Russian army? Does this bring down the prestige of the Russian army in a way that is irreparable at this point?
I think it might be irreparable, but we have within that very rich question, we have another classic mistake of imperial expansionist states, whether with Napoleon or the Nazis, overextension. And when you overextend your supply lines, and you have a conscript military that's misinformed and ill motivated, you've got serious problems. Versus the Ukrainian side, you've got a highly motivated volunteer, well, in some professional parts of their own military, and so your supposed asset of major superior force is basically nullified. And it's a kind of cliche in especially insurgency, counterinsurgency, which is what I teach about counterterrorism at Naval War College. And the basic cliche is that the Ukrainians will win as long as they don't lose. So the longer they can drag this out, the better, because then the supply line questions of the Russians will be, they'll be just burning gasoline, eating sandwiches, and doing nothing. And on the other hand, for the Russian side, if they can't, they will lose if they don't win. And winning, of course, in the face of brutality and loss of life on all sides, but they have to have a decisive victory, which is being denied by the factors which we've already outlined. So, on this question of morale, it's critical. Overextension is critical, and that's why Putin is now, instead of celebrating a fast victory, he's commiserating and getting more panicky about actually a loss, that not only a military loss, but he may lose his life and position by the time he's done. I think it's worth looking at, if you care to, a little bit of the biography of Putin, KGB agent. His grandfather actually was a cook for Lenin. His grandmother died and several older brothers died in World War II. So and of course, he was in GDR, East Germany, at the end of the Cold War. And so he's nursing all these grievances and sort of thrashing out. And the more you thrash out, if you're a military leader who's isolated, it's just going to get worse and worse. Of course, worse for the poor Ukrainians who are suffering from this, but also worse for himself. And once this is resolved in some other state, which we will see in the next week or 2 weeks or whatever, he'll probably be charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity. He'll be a total pariah, and so on the political level alone, maybe also judicial and legal level, he's already been defeated. However, this unfolds, and even just on the terrain question, thinking of Sun Tzu, he is surrounding Ukraine on basically 2.5 or 3 sides, but the Western side is absolutely confrontational with all the NATO countries, at least 5 NATO countries, and he's got no provision for dealing with that. In fact, according to the leaked documents of Lukashenko in Belarus, he was planning to take over Ukraine and then Moldova and so forth. Those plans are not going to happen. Because now NATO, which was another wild card that he imagined would just collapse and be divided, like he divided, with Trump and so forth, and dividing Americans, they would just collapse and wither away like they did in Donetsk and the Donbass region, and of course with Crimea. None of those things happened. So he's fundamentally miscalculated, and you can't start a really big war and make some really big mistakes and have it end up well for you. So we can still talk about those things in his own, biography and political outlook, and poor information, because he's just burying himself in his own misrepresentations and cyber warfare, which is now actually going against Russians too. So there's another aspect.
Yeah. So we've seen this war drag on longer than expected. Russia has now opened peace negotiations with the Zelensky government. They've met twice now. I'm sure it's not under the conditions that Putin thought he would be opening these talks, if he was going to open them at all. But there's been a lot of question as to whether or not, A, these talks will produce anything, attacks continue during these negotiations, as well as can Putin be trusted in these negotiations? So in your experience with Putin and his forces, have you seen anything that gives you hope that this could be resolved through peace negotiations in a way that doesn't give Putin everything that he feels entitled to?
Well, loving peace and really hating war, even though I work for the War College, I always will have a little bit of hope that their consents can come to the minds of these critical leaders. Certainly, that would be the Ukrainian preference. But like the sort of quip, if Putin's lips are moving, he's lying. He's got no credibility whatsoever telling the truth, or even when he says something that he would actually follow up on it. I mean, like there was going to be no invasion of Ukraine, for example. There's a big one right there, when he was, of course, clearly planning for that. So I can't imagine that the talks will make a ceasefire immediately effective, because he's still delusional to think that he's going to win this in a conventional and / unconventional means against civilian targets. Now we're into civilian targets. So I'm not very optimistic, except that you have to leave that open. That's Vladimir Zelensky's position, to leave it open, because you have to hope that something can happen. I think the political security of some general, though we don't know the name of, is going to realize that Russia's honor in the world is going to be is collapsing as we speak. The Russian economy. Just to bring out another sort of conventional military approach, we have the so-called DIME paradigm, PDIME. These are the 4 levers of power: D for diplomacy, I for intelligence information, M for military, and E for economics. You just go through that checklist on the Ukrainian side, and we're doing fantastic. Diplomacy is really strong. Information, people believe Zelensky. They're mobilized and motivated by Zelensky. Militarily, we can still come to that. And economically, Russia is being devastated, hourly by the extremely grave and serious sanctions, of which there could be a few more, but these are destroying the Russian economy and are mobilizing the active resistance within Russia itself, many of whom have, of course, ties and relatives in Ukraine, and they're feeling ashamed and distressed by this outrage. So there's a few comments about that question.
You mentioned conventional warfare and a move towards some unconventional tactics, illegal tactics, targeting of civilians. We also hear out of the Kremlin a lot of talk about nuclear capabilities, threats that any country that dares to intervene in this will be met with response never before seen, et cetera, putting the nuclear forces on high alert. You also mentioned that Putin can't be trusted. When Putin's speaking, he's lying. Is this merely posturing? Is the threat of nuclear war really hanging over the heads of the Ukrainians, of the Europeans, and by extension, states as well?
Well, hope that it will not be nuclear is very high. And I think at this moment, there's got to be somebody close to Putin or accessible to Putin who will not let that happen. That's just insanity. I mean, it's bad enough. And so there is some notion of escalatio and making these threats. They have to be taken seriously, so appropriate measures on the other side, with NATO's side. But in terms of just the weaponry, we have a few important factors to consider. The dominance of the Russian Air Force has been relatively low. I mean, it was expected to be higher. And the armor, which is not moving too much, is not that effective. And so when you have ground forces, the 190,000 or whatever, how many thousand there are actually, you only have maybe 20% of that's combat ready. The rest is logistics. And then if they get into an occupation force, then they're going to lose huge percentages of this large force to occupy a population, which will be throwing Molotov cocktails, shooting RPGs at tanks, sticking metal pipes in tank tracks and so forth. But the really interesting variable here is the javelins, the TOW missiles, and the Stinger missiles. Stingers are ground to air. TOW are against armor. It's a wire-guided missile against armor. And I think the US has already sent maybe 800, and other NATO countries have sent more. So we're talking about many thousands of Javelin missiles, and Javelin, of course, will be, ground to air. So any effort to mobilize, which they seem to be fairly reluctant, and now that 40-mile convoy of armor and supplies is simply not doing anything. And if you can use Turkish drones, which are now being deployed, and even there's some locally made, Ukrainian-made drones, and take out the beginning and end of that column, then the rest are just sitting ducks. They can't be resupplied. And then even Ukrainian ground forces with fairly modest weapons, and now these pretty critical other weapons can be deployed. And if within the next few days that column doesn't actually move aggressively or in offensive, they're just wasting their time. And this is the beginning of a catastrophic defeat. So that's what I'm basically looking at, in terms of just the tactical aspects of the basically failed Russian strategy.
So thank you for that good overview of some of the weapons that are being poured into Ukraine on Ukraine's side. One of the things that I've been hearing a lot about, but had not heard about before, is these thermobaric bombs that Russia has created. A number of organizations have condemned this weapon. Can you talk a little bit about what this weapon is, how it's used, how it functions, and why Putin would be deploying that in these cities?
Right. Well, there's 3 weapons in this theater that represent potential war crimes. Cluster bomb units, which the U.S. actually has, and we do use them ourselves, unfortunately. Thermobaric bombs, and the ballistic missiles. None of them are really guided at all. They're roughly heaved at the enemy in some place, but they're not discriminating whatsoever. And when they're used in areas where civilians are present, then they potentially are weapons engaging with crimes against humanity and war crimes, because they're not discriminating. The thermobaric bombs, of which we've used them in Tora Bora against the Taliban in Afghanistan, and they're pretty vicious weapons. Basically, it's a kind of 2-bomb unit. The thermo is the heat part, and the baric is the pressure part or vacuum. And what they put into the air is a very extensive cover of highly flammable gases, and then they ignite them. And then the gases then sucking up oxygen, and so they will kill people even in bomb shelters in caves or whatever else. They're extremely vicious weapons that, if they are defended at all, they would be defended in a purely military context. They have been seen in motion, maybe in that column, and so we have an intersection between the specific weapons and the war crimes potential. The other weapons, which have been deployed in several instances I've seen on the TV coverage, are cruise missiles, and the cruise missiles are guided, and they can be, very like at the TV station on top of the Babi Yar, museum. And some other places where they target specific administrative buildings, in some cases civilian buildings, hospitals and universities and other kind of things. These are guided, and so they are less likely to be. But if they're guided towards civilians, then you've got the same problem. Then it just makes another form of evil. I haven't mentioned tanks. I haven't mentioned mines, but both Ukrainians have mines which they're mining the roads that they think will be access roads. So far, I haven't heard too much about anti-personnel mines by the Russians because I don't know where they'd even deploy them. They can barely get off the roads. And if the anti-aircraft, javelins and stingers, and maybe even these old-fashioned small Strela missiles, which I witnessed personally, were critical in the war when the Russians were supporting the African liberation movements. They overthrew the Portuguese government actually after 500 years of colonialism. So, not to dwell on the tactics and the military weapons, but certainly they can be, quite decisive when you've already lost the game plan and you've already lost the morale. So we have a number of intersecting, features. Just in over, I haven't even mentioned the humanitarian part because I'm trying to focus on the military, tactical, strategic dimensions.
Yeah, we're going to have another one of these episodes that's going to focus a little bit more on the humanitarian. So we've got about a few minutes left here, and I know no one has a crystal ball to predict exactly how this is going to end, but can you run through a couple of different scenarios as to how this ends up, where this goes, and what it means for the world, for Russia, and for NATO/the West?
But this is a pivotal event in world history. Notice that the end game of the World War II was actually in Crimea as well, in the Yalta Conference of the Big Three, France not invited. And so Russia is, I haven't mentioned really, it's an informal mercenary group under the private direct control of Putin. This is the Wagner Group. And they are deployed widely in Syria, in Libya, now in Mali and Sudan and so forth, and of course in Ukraine. These are the special, sort of elite assassination teams infiltrated into Kiev, which, to my understanding, some have been captured and just summarily executed. So this is the potential of fundamentally reallocating world powers, and in Africa, in the Middle East. So it's at the macro level, and nothing of this scale since World War II, of course, when NATO and the Warsaw Pact were formed. So this was, we're at that particular level of profound challenge of the world order. For Putin himself, he's got the war crimes and the legal issues. He has his own political livelihood. He was a Communist Party member, but really he's not very dialectical in his thinking. And he was so delusional to think that he would just invade, everything would be terrific, that he has forgotten that when you go to war, it doesn't mean you're going to win, and your enemy loses. It never happens that way. War has, in the fog of war and the chaos of war and the unpredictable features of war, summarized importantly by Sun Tzu, by the way, he I think, is at very grave political risk from some generals somewhere who are very prideful of Russia and think that he is bringing Russia into global disgrace.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for your insights, for your time. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for joining us here today. We hope that you found this program useful. We hope that you learned something and that you will continue to follow this developing story as it continues.